Edit some choices are so impossible that they can change a man's life before he even answers. The wind had carried the storm across the Arizona mountains long before sunset, leaving behind cold rain, broken branches, and muddy trails where almost no traveler would dare continue. Nathan Brooks had planned to reach the next trading post before dark, but the frightened cry of a child drifting through the trees forced him to pull sharply on the reins. His horse stopped beside a narrow ravine where floodwater still rushed between smooth rocks, carrying fallen logs toward the valley below. There, beneath the shelter of a bent cottonwood, he spotted a small boy no older than 7, soaked from head to toe and desperately trying to protect a woman who had collapsed beside him. Nathan climbed down without hesitation. The little boy stepped in front of the woman with all the courage his small body could gather, his trembling hands stretched wide, as though he alone could stop the entire world. Nathan slowly removed his hat and knelt several feet away. "Easy now," he said in a calm voice. "I am here to help." The child searched his face for a long moment before lowering his hands. Nathan wrapped his weathered coat around the boy first, then carefully helped the woman sit upright against the trunk of the old tree. Her dark, braided hair clung to her shoulders, and a worn leather medicine pouch rested tightly against her side as though she had protected it through every mile of hardship. Her tired eyes opened slowly. They carried sorrow deeper than the gathering clouds, yet they remained steady, proud, and unbroken. Nathan offered her a canteen of fresh water. She accepted it with quiet gratitude, but drank only enough to ease her breathing before handing it back. The boy leaned against her shoulder. "Mama," he whispered softly, "is he staying?" Nathan looked away toward the fading lights spreading across the distant mesas. He had spent years making certain the answer to that question was always no. He repaired fences, rescued lost travelers, buried lonely strangers whose families never arrived, then quietly rode away before anyone learned enough about him to ask where he was. Going next, staying had never been part of his life. It was easier to leave than to watch another goodbye. He gathered dry cedar branches beneath a rocky overhang, and soon a small fire chased away the evening chill. The smell of smoke mixed with wet earth and desert sage, while tiny sparks drifted upward into the darkening sky. The little boy finally smiled for the first time, warming his hands beside the flames. The woman watched Nathan in complete silence, studying every careful movement he made. He never asked her name. He never questioned where she had come from. He simply shared the last piece of cornbread from his saddlebag and quietly broke it into 3 equal portions. The woman looked at the bread, then at the man sitting across the fire with his hat resting beside him. After a long silence, she spoke in clear England. The words lingered between them long after the fire had settled into glowing embers. Nathan looked across the flames at the woman, searching for any trace of desperation that might explain what he had just heard. Instead, he found only quiet dignity. She lowered her eyes toward the little boy sleeping peacefully beneath his weathered coat before speaking again. "My name is Kiona," she said softly. "My son is Daniel." Nathan nodded once. "Nathan Brooks." The introductions felt strangely ordinary after such extraordinary words. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Outside the shelter, rainwater dripped slowly from cedar branches while the cool night breeze carried the scent of wet earth across the mountains. Finally, Nathan cleared his throat. "You do not know me." Kiona met his eyes without hesitation. "No, but I know what happens to a widow with a child and nowhere to belong." Nathan remained silent. She continued in the same calm voice, never asking for pity. "My husband died many months ago from sickness during a hard winter. His family is gone. My parents are gone. The people who once called me daughter now struggle to feed their own children. I have carried my son from one valley to another hoping to find work, food, or simply another sunrise." She rested one hand gently on Daniel's shoulder. "He deserves more than endless roads." Nathan listened without interruption. He had heard many stories while drifting across the frontier, but this one carried no anger and no bitterness. It carried only truth. He stared into the fire, remembering another lifetime when he believed staying in one place was possible. His father had owned a small ranch where every neighbor knew every fence post, and every child rode the same dusty trails together. Then drought came. Debts followed. The ranch disappeared piece by piece until there was nothing left except memories and empty land. After burying both parents within the same year, Nathan sold the last horse carrying his family brand and promised himself he would never again build a life that could be taken away. Since then, every town had become another stop along the trail. Every handshake ended with goodbye. Every sunrise pointed toward another horizon. Remaining unattached had become easier than risking another loss. Kiona quietly watched the changing expressions on his face. "You have been leaving people behind for a long time," she said gently. Nathan gave a faint smile without humor. "You seem to know a great deal about strangers." She shook her head. "Not strangers. Lonely people." The answer settled deeply inside him because she had named the one truth he never admitted aloud. Just before dawn, Daniel slowly opened his eyes and sat upright beside the fire. He looked first at his mother, then at Nathan. Without saying a word, the little boy reached into his small blanket, removed a carved wooden horse worn smooth by years of tiny hands, and carefully placed it beside Nathan's coffee cup. "My father made that," he whispered. Nathan immediately picked it up. "You should keep it." Daniel smiled sleepily. "Mama says people who share warmth should never leave empty-handed." Nathan held the small wooden horse in complete silence. It weighed almost nothing, yet somehow it felt heavier than every saddlebag he had carried across the frontier. As the first rays of sunlight climbed over the distant mesas, he realized he had planned to ride away before breakfast, just as he always did. Instead, he remained seated beside the dying fire, unable to convince himself that this was only another stop along the trail. By the time the morning sun climbed above the rugged mesas, the storm had become nothing more than scattered drops glistening on cedar branches and patches of mist drifting through the valley. Nathan packed his saddlebag with practiced hands, folding his blanket exactly as he had done on hundreds of lonely mornings. The familiar routine should have made leaving easy. Instead, he found himself glancing toward Kiona and Daniel more often than toward the trail waiting beyond the hills. Daniel sat on a flat rock, carving tiny lines into another piece of wood with careful determination, while Kiona gathered fresh water from a narrow creek that wound quietly between smooth stones. The peaceful scene felt strangely complete, as though the wilderness itself had decided to pause before sending each traveler in a different direction. Nathan finally cleared his throat. "There is a trading settlement about 15 miles north. They might have work and supplies." Kiona returned with the filled canteen and offered him the first drink before answering. "Then we will walk that way." Nathan frowned slightly. "You do not have to follow my road." She smiled with quiet patience. "It is the safest road for my son today." There was no pressure in her voice, no attempt to persuade him. She simply spoke the truth as she saw it. They began walking together beneath a sky washed clean by the storm. Wildflowers pushed through the damp earth, their colors brighter after the rain, while hawks circled lazily above the distant cliffs. Daniel skipped ahead from time to time, stopping whenever he discovered an interesting stone or feather. Every few minutes, he turned to make certain Nathan was still behind him. That simple habit stirred something inside the cowboy that he had spent years trying to silence. Near midday, they reached a weathered footbridge crossing a shallow stream. On the opposite side, an elderly settler struggled to lift a heavy sack of flour that had slipped from his wagon. Without exchanging a single word, Nathan walked over and hoisted the sack onto the wagon bed, while Kiona noticed that one of the wagon horses had been favoring its front leg. She knelt beside the gentle animal, examined the hoof, and carefully removed a small sharp stone lodged beneath it. The horse relaxed almost immediately, lowering its head as though grateful for the relief. The old man looked first at Nathan, then at Kiona, surprise slowly replacing caution. "I do not have much to offer," he said, reaching into the wagon. He handed Daniel a bright red apple, then offered fresh biscuits wrapped in a clean cloth to the adults. Nathan accepted only one before nodding toward Kiona. "She earned these as much as I did." The old man smiled warmly and placed the cloth into her hands without hesitation. As they continued down the trail, Daniel held the apple like a priceless treasure. After a few minutes, he quietly broke it into 3 uneven pieces. He gave the largest piece to his mother, another to Nathan, and kept the smallest for himself. Nathan noticed immediately. "You should take the biggest piece," he said. Daniel shook his head with innocent certainty. "Mama says families make sure everyone eats." Nathan looked at the child, then at Kiona, who simply lowered her eyes with a gentle smile. He wanted to explain that they were not a family. The words reached his lips, but refused to leave. Instead, he accepted the apple in silence. And as they walked beneath the endless western sky, he realized the little boy had already begun seeing the world in a way that frightened him more than loneliness ever had, because somewhere deep inside, he was beginning to see it the same way. Late that afternoon, the narrow trail climbed toward a broad ridge where the wind carried the sweet scent of sun-warmed pine and distant sage across the open country. Beyond the ridge lay a small farming settlement surrounded by simple fences, grazing cattle, and fields that had only begun to recover after the recent storms. Nathan slowed his horse as they approached, noticing several neighbors gathered around a weathered barn whose roof had partially collapsed beneath the weight of soaked timber. Without waiting to be asked, he climbed down from the saddle, removed his gloves, and walked toward the scattered beams. Kiona quietly followed with Daniel. Beside her, the farmers welcomed Nathan with grateful smiles, then looked uncertainly at Kiona before returning their attention to the damaged building. She showed no sign of offense. Instead, she noticed an elderly woman sitting alone beneath the porch, holding one arm carefully against her side while trying not to draw attention to herself. Kiona knelt beside her with gentle respect and asked permission before examining the sore shoulder. The older woman nodded quietly. From her familiar medicine pouch, Kiona prepared a simple cloth soaked with cool water and fragrant herbs, then wrapped it carefully around the woman's shoulder. Within minutes, the woman's tense expression softened into visible relief. Meanwhile, Nathan worked beside the farmers, lifting heavy boards back into place, measuring replacement supports, and securing loose beams with steady hands that had repaired more ranch buildings than he could remember. Sweat mixed with sawdust beneath the warm afternoon sun, while Daniel proudly carried handfuls of small wooden pegs from one worker to another, determined to help in every way his little legs could manage. By sunset, the barn once again stood solid against the western sky. The farmers gathered near the entrance with baskets of fresh vegetables, homemade bread, and jars of preserved peaches. One man stepped forward, placing the gifts into Nathan's arms. Nathan accepted them only long enough to hand nearly everything to Kiona. "She helped as much as I did," he said simply. The farmer looked toward Kiona with thoughtful eyes, then removed his hat. "Then thank you, ma'am. We are grateful." Kiona smiled warmly. Kindness grows faster when it is shared. The elderly woman slowly walked across the yard, her shoulder moving far more freely than before. She reached for Kiona's hands and squeezed them gently. "I judged you before I knew you," she admitted softly. "Today you reminded me that a good heart does not wear one face." Nathan watched the exchange in silence, realizing that no speech could have changed that woman's mind as completely as one quiet act of compassion. As evening settled across the valley, the family was invited to share supper beneath strings of lanterns hanging between two old oak trees. Fresh cornbread, beans, roasted vegetables, and warm apple pie filled the long wooden table while neighbors laughed together beneath the fading light. Daniel leaned close to Nathan and whispered, "This feels like home." Nathan looked around the table, then toward Kiona, who was smiling as she listened to the elderly woman's stories. For a brief moment, he almost answered yes. Instead, he quietly looked toward the distant horizon glowing orange beyond the fields. For years, every sunset had reminded him that it was time to leave before roots could begin to grow. Yet as the first evening stars appeared above the prairie, he discovered that the thought of riding away tomorrow no longer brought comfort. It brought something far more unsettling. It brought regret before he had even said goodbye. Kiona, Nathan, and Daniel left the farming settlement the following morning with grateful smiles still lingering in their memories. The wagon tracks behind them slowly disappeared beneath the dry prairie wind, while the rising sun painted the distant mesas in warm shades of amber and gold. Daniel walked between them, swinging the small carved wooden horse in one hand and humming a tune he had learned from one of the farmers the night before. Nathan found himself smiling without realizing it. It had been years since another person's happiness had quietly become part of his own. The trail soon curved alongside a wide meadow where dozens of horses grazed peacefully behind a weathered fence that had partially collapsed after the recent storms. An anxious ranch hand stood alone, struggling to guide the restless animals away from the broken section before they wandered into the open hills. Nathan immediately crossed the field, and began lifting heavy fence rails back into place while the ranch hand gathered fresh posts. Kiona noticed an older mare standing apart from the herd, favoring one leg and refusing to move. She approached slowly, speaking in a calm voice that seemed to settle both the horse and the morning itself. After gently examining the injured hoof, she removed a small thorn hidden beneath it and washed the area with cool water mixed with herbs from her medicine pouch. Within moments, the mare lowered her head peacefully and placed weight on the leg again. Daniel clapped his hands with quiet excitement, proud that his mother had once again eased another creature's pain. By midday, the damaged fence stood firm, and the horses wandered safely across the pasture once more. The grateful ranch owner invited the three travelers to rest beneath a large cottonwood tree where fresh lemonade, homemade bread, and sliced peaches waited on a rough wooden table. As they shared the simple meal, the ranch owner watched Daniel laughing beside Nathan while they skipped smooth stones across a nearby creek. "He follows you everywhere," the old rancher observed with a gentle smile. Nathan looked toward the little boy, who proudly counted every stone that touched the water before sinking beneath the gentle current. "Children deserve someone they can trust," Nathan answered quietly. The ranch owner nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes trust chooses us before we realize it." Those words stayed with Nathan long after they resumed their journey. As afternoon drifted toward evening, Daniel became tired from the long walk. Without thinking, Nathan lifted the boy onto his horse and adjusted the stirrups so the child could sit comfortably in front of him. Daniel leaned back against Nathan's chest with complete confidence, pointing excitedly toward hawks circling high above the valley while asking endless questions about horses, ranches, and distant mountains. Nathan answered every one with patient warmth. Kiona walked beside them, watching the quiet exchange without interrupting. She had seen many people offer kindness for a single afternoon. What she saw now was something different. Nathan no longer helped because someone needed rescuing. He stayed because leaving had begun to feel wrong. As the first stars appeared above the prairie, they made camp beside a gentle creek lined with tall cottonwood trees. The air carried the fragrance of cedar smoke and wild sage while crickets filled the evening with steady song. After Daniel fell asleep, wrapped in his blanket, Kiona reached into her medicine pouch and removed a simple braided leather cord with a small polished river stone tied at its center. She placed it beside Nathan's tin cup. He looked at her with quiet surprise. "What is this for?" She smiled softly. "In my family, travelers carried these to remember the place where fear first became hope." Nathan gently lifted the cord into his hand, feeling the smooth stone rest against his palm beside the small wooden horse Daniel had given him. Neither gift held great value to anyone else. Yet together they carried something he had not possessed in many years. They reminded him that somewhere along this dusty trail, the lonely road had quietly begun leading him toward a family instead of away from one. Kiona awoke before sunrise as she always had, quietly adding fresh cedar branches to the fading campfire while the first pale light spread across the Arizona sky. Nathan opened his eyes a few minutes later to find Daniel already awake, sitting beside the creek and carefully skipping flat stones across the calm water. For the first time in many years, Nathan did not wake with the familiar thought of how many miles he should cover before sunset. Instead, he wondered where the three of them might stop for supper. The realization unsettled him more than any lonely trail ever had. After a simple breakfast of fresh bread, dried fruit, and coffee warmed over the fire, they continued toward a valley where Kiona believed members of her Apache community sometimes traveled during the warmer months. The landscape gradually changed as towering cottonwood trees replaced scattered cedar, and wildflowers painted the grasslands with quiet splashes of blue, yellow, and crimson. Daniel laughed whenever butterflies drifted across the trail, chasing them for a few yards before running back to Nathan with another question about horses, rivers, or the mountains waiting beyond the horizon. By midday, they reached a shallow creek where several travelers had stopped to rest beneath the shade of large sycamore trees. Among them was a young mother struggling to calm her frightened baby, who had been crying without pause since morning. Kiona gently asked permission before approaching. She prepared cool water with fragrant herbs, wrapped the damp cloth around the child's forehead for a few moments, and softly hummed an old Apache lullaby. The baby gradually relaxed, tiny fingers curling peacefully around the edge of the blanket before drifting into sleep. The grateful mother smiled through relieved eyes and thanked her with heartfelt sincerity. Nearby, Nathan noticed an elderly rancher trying to repair a broken wagon wheel alone. He quietly joined the man, gathering sturdy branches to support the axle until a proper repair could be made in town. The old rancher studied Nathan for a moment before speaking. "You travel with a good family." Nathan instinctively opened his mouth to explain that they were only companions sharing the same road, but Daniel suddenly ran over carrying 3 cups of cool spring water. Without hesitation, the little boy handed one to Nathan first, another to his mother, and kept the last for himself. "Families always drink together," Daniel said with an innocent smile before sitting between them in the shade. Nathan looked toward Kiona. She said nothing. She simply watched him with calm eyes that never demanded answers he was not ready to give. As evening approached, the travelers reached a broad overlook where the valley stretched for miles beneath the golden glow of sunset. In the distance, thin trails of campfire smoke rose gently into the still air. "Kiona, stop." The final stretch of the trail wound gently between towering cottonwood trees before opening into a quiet valley where smoke curled peacefully from cooking fires beneath the warm afternoon sun. Daniel's eyes brightened the moment he recognized familiar songs drifting on the breeze. He ran a few steps ahead before stopping beside Kiona, waiting for her hand as though he understood that some homecomings deserved to begin together. Nathan remained a short distance behind them, allowing mother and son to walk forward first. Several Apache families slowly emerged from the valley, their expressions filled with surprise before soft smiles replaced uncertainty. Children hurried toward Daniel, welcoming him with excited laughter, while older women embraced Kiona with quiet relief. Nathan watched the reunion without interrupting. He felt grateful to see them surrounded by people who truly knew them, yet each smile reminded him that his own place in their story was quietly reaching its end. After the first greetings had settled, an elderly Apache leader stepped forward. His weathered face carried years of wisdom rather than judgment. He thanked Nathan for bringing Kiona and Daniel home safely, then invited him to remain as an honored guest until morning. Nathan accepted respectfully. As evening approached, the valley filled with the comforting sounds of shared meals, gentle conversation, and children playing beside the creek. Daniel rarely wandered far from Nathan, proudly introducing him to everyone he met as the cowboy who had protected them on the journey. Nathan smiled politely each time, though inside he quietly reminded himself that tomorrow he would ride away as he always had. After supper, the elder invited Nathan to walk with him beyond the camp where the hills overlooked the glowing valley below. They stood together in comfortable silence while the last rays of sunlight settled across the prairie. Finally, the elder spoke. "Kiona has told me about your kindness." Nathan shook his head modestly. "Anyone would have done the same." The elder smiled gently. "No, many people would have continued riding." The old man looked toward the camp where Daniel laughed beside the fire. "The boy already trusts you." Nathan lowered his eyes. "That is why I should leave." The elder studied him carefully. "Explain." Nathan drew a slow breath. "If I remain, people may believe I am trying to take him away from his own people. If I stay beside Kiona, she may carry burdens she does not deserve. I have spent my life leaving before I become someone else's problem. Perhaps that is what I should do again." The elder remained silent for a long moment before answering. "You believe leaving protects those you care about. That is a heavy belief to carry." Nathan looked across the valley where lanterns glowed beside the creek. "Sometimes it is easier to be remembered kindly than to disappoint someone later." The elder nodded thoughtfully. "Tomorrow morning I will ask Kiona only one question. Not whether she wishes you to stay. She has already shown that. I will ask whether she believes you bring peace into her son's life. The answer will belong to her alone." Nathan listened without speaking. As he returned toward the camp, he paused beside his horse and quietly tightened the saddle straps beneath the fading light. He told himself it was simply preparation for an early departure. Yet when Daniel wandered over carrying the small carved wooden horse and carefully tucked it into Nathan's saddlebag so it would not be forgotten, the cowboy found himself unable to say what he had planned all evening. He merely rested one gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, looking toward the campfire where Kiona waited, and wondered whether the hardest journey a man could ever make was not across the frontier, but across the distance between the life he had always known and the home quietly asking him to remain. The morning arrived wrapped in quiet golden light as soft mist drifted above the creek winding through the Apache Valley. Nathan had already saddled his horse before most of the camp had awakened. The familiar routine steadied his hands, yet every movement felt heavier than it had the day before. The small carved wooden horse rested safely inside his saddlebag beside the braided leather cord and polished stone Kiona had given him along the journey. 3 simple gifts had somehow become the heaviest things he carried. As he tightened the final strap, Daniel came running across the grass with the easy smile of a child who believed every morning promised another adventure. "Are we riding today?" he asked happily. Nathan forced a gentle smile and rested one hand on the boy's shoulder. "Maybe not together." Daniel frowned, unable to understand the sadness hidden inside those few words. Before either of them could speak again, the elder approached with calm, steady steps. Several families quietly gathered beneath a broad cottonwood tree where morning sunlight filtered gently through the leaves. There was no ceremony, no display, only peaceful silence carried by the cool breeze. The elder looked first toward Kiona. She stood beside her son with quiet confidence, her medicine pouch resting at her side exactly as it had on the day Nathan first found her beside the flooded ravine. The elder asked only one question. "When the difficult seasons return, who brings peace to your son's heart?" Kiona did not hesitate. She turned toward Nathan before answering. "The man who never promised us tomorrow, yet never stopped choosing kindness today." The elder nodded thoughtfully before facing Nathan. "And when hardship comes to you, where will your own heart return?" Nathan looked toward the valley stretching peacefully beneath the morning sky. He saw children laughing beside the creek, elders preparing breakfast together, horses grazing beyond the cottonwood trees, and Daniel watching him with complete trust. Then he looked at Kiona, whose calm eyes carried neither expectation nor fear. She would not ask him to remain. She would not ask him to leave. The choice belonged entirely to him. Nathan slowly removed the saddle from his horse and placed it carefully upon the ground. The quiet sound of leather touching the grass seemed louder than any speech he could have given. He walked toward Kiona and Daniel without hurry until he stood beside them beneath the tree. Looking first at the elder, then at the little boy, he finally spoke with a steady voice that surprised even himself. "For many years I believed that leaving protected the people I cared about. I know now that sometimes staying is the braver choice." Daniel smiled before wrapping both small arms around Nathan's waist. The cowboy laughed softly, his eyes shining with emotion he no longer wished to hide. Kiona reached into her medicine pouch and removed a small woven bracelet made from simple leather and blue thread. She tied it gently around Nathan's wrist. "My grandmother believed these should only be given to those who arrive as strangers and remain as family." Nathan looked down at the bracelet beside the braided cord he still carried in his pocket and quietly understood that no grand promise had been spoken between them. None was needed. Around them, the valley slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm as families prepared for another day. Beneath the western sun, yet everything had quietly changed. The longest road Nathan had ever traveled had not ended at the edge of the Apache Valley. It had ended inside his own heart. At the moment he finally stopped mistaking loneliness for freedom and discovered that true courage sometimes meant building a home instead of searching for another horizon. The seasons turned quietly, one after another, until the valley itself seemed to measure time not by calendars, but by blooming wildflowers, autumn leaves, and the first frost that silvered the grass each winter morning. Nathan no longer counted the miles behind him because there were no more lonely roads waiting to be conquered. Instead, he measured his days by the sound of Daniel laughing beside the creek, by the familiar scent of fresh bread drifting from the outdoor oven where Kiona prepared meals for neighbors and travelers, and by the steady rhythm of honest work shared beneath the endless western sky. Together they built a modest ranch near the edge of the Apache Valley where open pasture met cottonwood groves and a clear stream carried mountain water across the prairie. It was not the largest ranch in the territory, nor the richest, but it became known for something far more valuable. Any traveler who arrived hungry received a warm meal. Any horse with tired legs found fresh water and rest. Any family facing hardship discovered willing hands before they ever needed to ask. Nathan repaired broken wagons and worn fences with the same quiet patience that had once carried him across the frontier alone. Kiona cared for the sick, prepared healing herbs gathered from the surrounding hills, and welcomed every visitor with calm dignity that made strangers feel like old friends. Daniel grew taller with each passing season, learning to ride beside Nathan at sunrise and to gather herbs beside his mother before sunset. He carried the kindness of both worlds without ever believing he had to choose between them. One bright autumn afternoon, the elderly farmer whose barn Nathan had helped rebuild arrived with his family carrying baskets filled with apples, pumpkins, and fresh preserves. Not long afterward, the ranch owner whose horses Kiona had treated appeared with two healthy colts as a gift of gratitude. Before sunset, the young mother whose baby had found comfort beneath Kiona's gentle care walked through the gate, holding the hand of her smiling child. They had all traveled different roads, yet every one of them had returned to the same place. As laughter filled the yard, Nathan quietly noticed something remarkable. No one spoke about who had been born Apache. No one spoke about who had been born a cowboy. They spoke only about harvests, children, horses, weather, and friendship. The walls that once seemed impossible had slowly disappeared through countless ordinary acts of kindness repeated day after day. Later that evening, after every guest had returned home, Nathan and Kiona sat together on the familiar porch while Daniel carved another small wooden horse beneath the warm glow of a lantern. Nathan reached into his pocket and removed the tiny carved horse Daniel had given him on the morning they first met. The edges had become smooth from years of being carried wherever he went. Beside it rested the braided leather cord with its polished stone, still reminding him where fear had first become hope. Kiona smiled when she saw both keepsakes. You never stopped carrying them. Nathan looked across the peaceful valley where lantern light reflected softly upon the creek. They reminded me where my life truly began. Daniel looked up from his carving with curious eyes. I thought your life began before you met us. Nathan smiled gently and shook his head. I was living before then, but I did not know where I belonged. The cool evening breeze carried the scent of cedar and wild sage across the porch, while stars slowly appeared above the mountains one by one. Nathan slipped the small wooden horse back into his pocket, reached for Kiona's hand, and quietly watched Daniel finish carving another gift for some traveler he had not yet met. The frontier would always be filled with long roads, uncertain weather, and people searching for a place to call home. But one lonely cowboy had finally learned that the greatest journey was never about finding another horizon. It was about becoming the safe place where someone else's journey could finally come to rest.